Let's bring in National Executive Director of the Association of the U.S. Navy, retired Navy Master Sergeant Jason Beardley. He's a decorated combat veteran and intelligence officer. Also with us, former Democratic Congresswoman Jane Harman of California. She is a distinguished fellow and President Emeritus at the Wilson Center, and MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle joins us. Well, good to have you all.
So, Sergeant, let's begin with you. We've heard what Vladimir Putin said. The news broke overnight that they're not going to storm into there, which, of course, it would be an absolute nightmare. The Russian troops would be, I think, ground up if they did go in there. I'm just wondering how much of right now it's. Of course, we're looking at Mariupol and the suffering there, but you look at this, and it's hard not to see it as a setback if one of the great achievements of Mariupol for the Ukrainian fighters has been holding down Russian troops there so they can't help in the Donbass, so they couldn't have helped before in Kyiv. This seems like it just locks them down even longer.
Yeah, that's a great point, because what Russia hoped to do was siege this city, much like they tried in Kyiv, and to really occupy it in quick form. That would have allowed them to flex those Russian troops and supplies north to advance their line. This Mariupol, it's on the port. It's very close to the south, has no deep penetration into the Luhansk, Donetsk region. So it is not a key strategic victory for Putin. But more importantly, he's lost troops there. He's lost time. He's lost momentum. And for the Ukrainians, this is about spirit. It's about will, as you mentioned, and Rolf mentioned. Watching what happens in Bucha, they have no incentive to give up. I thought what Zelensky did was terrific. He's got to make at least ovations to do a diplomatic sort of entreaty. But Vladimir Putin is going to try to run this out. But what he said was really face-saving theater, because this whole campaign has gone south for him.
Jane Harman, based upon your past experience in the Congress and your access to intelligence, I realize you don't have as much of it today as you did then. Would you believe Vladimir Putin about anything at this stage?
Not a chance, Mike. Let me make 2 points. First of all, on the French election, I'm still holding my breath with Ed Luce. There's 72 hours left until voting on Sunday. Joe knows how long a time that is in politics. We've lived through these campaigns, and actually so have you. Russian interference, Russian disinformation, Russian meddling with the apparatus of the election should be going on right now. Haven't seen the intelligence, but it's got to be going on. The last day before the election is dark in France, but there's still 48 hours to go. And Macron is not a natural campaigner. And I hope the spread is as wide as everyone is saying, but I don't know that. And if Le Pen should somehow win, she wants to pull out of the EU. She's Vladimir Putin's friend. It's a catastrophe. So that's one thing I'm worried about. On the other thing, May 9th is soon. Vladimir Putin wants a scalp, and Mariupol is it. And it is the land bridge to Crimea. So I think the stakes here are huge for him. And he's handling it, I have to say, in the most cruel and gruesome way. But what he wants, I think, is all those civilians pouring out of that building just before, something even worse happens to them. And I'm for Zelensky. The fighting heart of Ukraine is something we haven't seen in years and years and years, and we have to bet on their success. And I don't believe Vladimir Putin for a minute, and any deal with him won't be kept. And so the alternative to me is keep on fighting, keep on supplying more weapons, think about more ways to attack the Russian depots by the Ukrainians, and more ways to shoot down those missiles. They have the S-300s. They have tools. I'm not sure how effective they are. I know there's an issue about getting some of the weaponry to the front, and hopefully that'll be corrected.
Well, Ukraine has at least 20 more fighter jets in the air after receiving shipments of spare parts that made the repairs possible. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said earlier this week that Ukraine had been sent additional aircraft as well, but clarified yesterday that Ukraine has not received a whole aircraft. U.S. troops have also begun training Ukrainians on how to use howitzer artillery and rounds that have arrived in Europe. The training, which is taking place at an undisclosed location outside Ukraine, will last about a week. The howitzers were part of an $800 million military aid package approved by the Biden administration last week. Master Sergeant Jason Beardsley, how effective will this investment be? And I also want to then bring you back to the people inside that steel plant in Mariupol, confirming there will be no international effort to help them as they are starving.
Well, we'll start with the artillery pieces. That's a great addition from the U.S. It's a second round of triggered sort of military supply. But part of this effectiveness is going to depend on how quickly the Ukrainian forces can integrate those pieces well and the joint sort of structure of their military forces in this region. So the artillery piece is difficult. It takes extra crews to man. You need extra vehicles. It's basic soldiering, like camouflaging that piece. You've got to set it up in proximity to Russian artillery pieces and then be prepared to move it, camouflaging tracks inside the hide site, making sure you can obscure radar. Those are big targets for air. So having the air defense artillery pieces or air defense pieces next to those, that's going to be key. That all of that requires command and control and coordination. And this early battle has been characterized much more for Ukraine as guerrilla warfare style tactics. That's hit and run, that's small units, that's moving around with the switchblades, the javelins, and the tows. So artillery is a new style of warfare. They're equipped for it. They've done this before, but getting those in their hands immediately and to the front to be effective, that's going to be a challenge, and it's going to come down to how much command and control Zelensky or the military forces have. Down to the people in Mariupol. The tragic story, as you said, I think the former guest pointed out, what Putin's doing there is gruesome. He wants a scalp. He does want the city, but it's been a high cost for Russia. And for Zelensky, anything he can do to either reinforce, and I think, Joe, you asked a question earlier about why not flex or flow other forces from the region down there and break that siege. That's a terrific question. Some of that may just come down to a gap in communication.
Jane Harman, President Biden is supposed to speak at 9:45 Eastern Time during our fourth hour. We'll probably take it live. What are you hoping to hear from him?
I want him to be the biggest, boldest leader he can be. He has forged an amazing coalition with Europe, with NATO, with the EU. He has to be crystal clear that if Putin, if there's a wisp of contact with a NATO country coming out of this thing, NATO will respond, including the U.S. But also, I think we're missing a few pieces. What happened to the UN? Why isn't the UN? It has the authority to do this under a General Assembly resolution. Doesn't need the Security Council. Where are the peacekeepers from the UN? And we also need from Biden a day-after strategy. I'm hoping this will come out well in Mariupol, and I'm hoping that there will be more supplies at the front. The Ukrainians are very talented, and they're very well trained by U.S. forces. So let's fingers crossed on that thing. But what is the day-after strategy? And how are we going to rally the world, not just Europe, to our side? The Middle East, Africa, Latin America, India, these are all countries holding back. And if we're going to have either the so-called liberal world order survive or a better world order, we better be building it right now. I mean, and this is a big challenge for Joe Biden, who needs to be, American leadership needs to be at the front.
You're so right, Jane. So many countries, major countries, have been silent or worse on the question of Ukraine. Sergeant Beardsley, I'm curious, we were talking to another general yesterday about this. In the last month and a half, just watching this Russian military, learning from it as you would as a military strategist, as a tactician, what have you seen that would encourage you as a military leader, if you were leading the Ukrainian troops or perhaps an American military leader advising Ukrainian troops? What would embolden you and encourage you about what you've seen, and what might discourage you that you've seen? That they've pulled back to the east, they can supply their troops better, and it might be a more difficult fight in the east than it was to repel the Russians from, say, Kyiv?
Well, I think those are two worthwhile questions. What encourages us is that they have very poorly handled the supply of their armor. They've poorly handled the disposition of their troops. They got over their skis, so to speak, in this, and they really banked on a fast, decapitation of Kyiv. And what we saw instead was broken trucks, not well-maintained trucks, and tanks stuck in the mud. low morale by the Russian forces, a very sort of distinctive gap between command and control elements. That's where you're moving different parts of the battlefield. They have not been good at any of this. So that's somewhat encouraging. The discouraging part of that, Willie, is that what it's really meant is that the Russian forces, without professionalism, have relied on desperate, non-professional means, atrociously brutalizing these civilian cities. They have absolutely no real-world NCO corps that we talked about, or somebody talked about it earlier, that would restrain them from these civilian atrocities. That's a disaster, and it shows that there are no good outcomes here. Whatever happens, no matter what Zelensky gets at the end of this, they've lost cities and they've lost people. So the best way, as Representative Harman said, was we've got to flow weapons into them quickly, and the military strategists in Ukraine have got to come up with a strategic vision that allows their ingenuity, their creative guerrilla warfare tactics to set up underneath that strategy. An example of that is forcing your weapons or flowing them into a certain part of the battlefield to knock out something like the siege in Mariupol, knock out those artillery pieces, and then be prepared to flex them north to defend another city. But if they don't get that coordinated, it's going to be randomized attacks, and this goes on longer. So there are some upsides to this. The Ukrainians have done a phenomenal job. People will be studying this war for years to come.